0024. In August of 1683, a single janissary collapsed on the road outside Vienna. His name has been lost. The chroniclers who recorded the campaign mentioned him in passing, one line in a logistics report filed by an officer who was counting the dead so he could request replacements. The man had been marching for 4 months. His boots were filled with blood. The leather had fused to the skin of his feet somewhere outside Belgrade, and by the time he reached the outskirts of the Habsburg capital, every step was leaving a wet print on the dirt behind him. He didn't stop. He didn't ask for help. He marched until his legs simply refused to carry him, and then he fell sideways into a ditch beside the road and died there, still wearing the white cap that marked him as elite infantry. He had walked roughly 1,000 miles to die in that ditch. Now picture that road, trace it on a map. Start at Istanbul, the great city on the Bosphorus, the heart of an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen. Move northwest, cross the plains of Thrace, climb the passes of the Balkan Mountains, descend into the Danube Valley, pass through Sofia, then Niš, then Belgrade, follow the river west through Buda, push north through Hungary, reach the walls of Vienna. 1,000 miles, on foot, in armor, carrying everything you owned on your back. That was a single Ottoman campaign. On board that march, alongside the man who died in the ditch, were roughly 100,000 other soldiers. They came from every corner of the empire. Janissaries from the palace school in Istanbul, cavalry from the Anatolian plateau, auxiliaries from the Balkans, irregulars from the famine villages of the interior. They marched together, ate together, and bled together. And when the army finally broke against the walls of Vienna and turned around to limp home, they died together too. But 2 of those soldiers were different from the rest. Not because they fought harder, not because they were braver. They were different because the empire had decided, before either of them ever lifted a weapon, which one of them was worth keeping alive and which one was not. Their names were Mehmed of Trabzon and Yusuf the Azab. One was a janissary, the other was an irregular infantryman. They walked the same road, they fought in the same war, they breathed the same dust. And when the retreat from Vienna began in September of 1683, only one of them was pulled into a supply wagon and carried home. The other was left in a Hungarian field to die of dysentery and exposure. His body never recovered, his name preserved only because a single janissary officer happened to mention him in a letter. What happened to those 2 men is the real story of how the Ottoman army endured a 1,000-mile campaign. It isn't a story about toughness. It isn't a story about discipline or faith or the hardness of the men who carried the empire to the gates of Europe. Those things existed, but they aren't the answer. The answer is darker and more disturbing because it's a story about a system that had decided in advance which soldiers would be fed and which would starve, which would be carried and which would walk, which would come home and which would be forgotten in a foreign field. This is the untold story of who the Ottoman war machine actually kept alive on the road to Vienna, and why. The year is 1453. The Ottoman Empire has just taken Constantinople, and a young sultan named Mehmed II is sitting in the palace of the Byzantine emperors he just destroyed. From that moment forward, the empire enters 2.5 centuries of almost continuous expansion. Picture the territory on a map. The Balkans, Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, the Hejaz, Mesopotamia, North Africa as far west as Algiers. By the time Suleiman the Magnificent dies in 1566, the Ottoman Sultan rules more people than any monarch in Europe and commands an army larger than anything Christendom can field against him. But here's the part that gets glossed over in the history books. An empire that size doesn't run on conquest. It runs on logistics. And the logistics of moving an Ottoman army from Istanbul to the front line was one of the most complicated administrative operations in the early modern world. The road they used was called the Sol Kol, the left arm. It was the imperial campaign route that ran northwest out of Istanbul, through the Balkans, and into Central Europe. The right arm ran east toward Persia. The middle arm ran south toward Egypt and Arabia. Each road was maintained by the state. Each had stone bridges, stockpiled grain, and a network of relay stations called menzil posts where the army could rest and resupply. The Salkal had been in continuous use since the 14th century. By the time of Sulayman's campaigns, it was the most heavily traveled military road in the world. Now consider what it took to move an army of 100,000 men down that road. The food alone is staggering. A soldier in the field needed roughly 2 pounds of grain per day to keep marching. 100,000 men needed 200,000 pounds of grain every single day. That's 100 tons, every day, for months. And that's just the men. The horses needed grain too. The pack animals needed grain. The camels carrying the artillery needed grain. The total daily requirement for a major Ottoman campaign was somewhere between 300 and 500 tons of food, every single day. The empire solved this problem with a system called suicide. Villages along the campaign road were legally required to deliver grain, meat, and fodder to the menzil stations in exchange for tax credits. The system was efficient on paper. In practice, it meant entire regions were stripped bare every time an army marched through. Peasants who refused to deliver their quota were beaten or executed. Peasants who delivered their quota often starved through the following winter. The Ottoman war machine was fueled by the systematic dismantling of every village it passed. So far, this is the story you can find in any decent history of the empire. The march, the menzil, the suicide, the discipline. Historians call it one of the most sophisticated logistical operations of the pre-industrial era, and they're right. It worked. It moved enormous armies enormous distances. It conquered cities that European armies couldn't even reach. But the story has a blind spot, a massive one. Because when historians talk about the Ottoman army, they almost always mean the Janissaries, the elite slave infantry, the disciplined musket regiments, the men in the white caps, and the Janissaries are a fascinating story, but they were never more than a fraction of the army that actually marched. In a typical campaign, the Janissaries numbered between 10 and 20,000 men. The total army was 5 to 10 times that size. The rest were something else entirely. Cavalry feudatories called sipahis, provincial auxiliaries, and at the very bottom of the structure the irregulars, the azabs, the volunteer infantry. Most of the men who walked from Istanbul to Vienna were azabs. Most of the men who died on the road were azabs, and almost none of them have names in the chronicles. That blind spot isn't an accident. It's the thesis of this story. The Ottoman system didn't just move soldiers. It sorted them. It decided which lives mattered to the empire and which were fuel. And once you understand how that sorting worked, you can never look at the Ottoman conquests the same way again. Before we get to the road, you need to understand the two men who walked it. Because the story only lands the way it does when you see what they came from and what they were promised. Mehmed of Trabzon was born around 1655 in a small Christian village in the mountains above the Black Sea coast. His father was a fisherman. His mother kept goats. He had 3 brothers and a sister. The family was poor but stable. They paid their taxes to the local Ottoman governor and were left alone to live their lives. When Mehmed was 8 years old, the imperial recruiters arrived in his village. The system was called devshirm, the child levy. Every few years, Ottoman officials moved through the Christian villages of the Balkans and Anatolia and selected the strongest, smartest, healthiest boys for service to the Sultan. The selection was not optional. Families who hid their sons were punished. Boys who were chosen were marched away that same day, often barefoot, often without being allowed to say goodbye. Mehmed was one of those boys. He was 8 years old when he last saw his mother. He never saw her again. The boys were taken to Istanbul and sorted. The handsomest and most intelligent were sent to the palace school to be trained as administrators and future bureaucrats. The strongest were sent to the Janissary barracks. Mehmed was strong. He went to the barracks. He was converted to Islam, given a new name, and entered into a training regimen that lasted 10 years. He learned Turkish. He learned the Quran. He learned to handle a musket, a saber, and a pike. He learned to march in formation, to fire in volleys, to dig siege trenches in a single night. By the time he was 18, he was a soldier. By the time he was 20, he was a veteran. By the summer of 1683, he was 28 years old and one of the elite infantrymen of the Ottoman Empire. He had not seen his family in 20 years. He could no longer remember his mother's face. He had been trained, fed, clothed, and paid by the state since the day they took him. The empire had built him from the ground up, and in exchange, the empire owned him completely. This was the bargain. The Janissaries belonged to the Sultan. They were slaves in a technical legal sense, though they wielded enormous power. They could not marry without permission. They could not own property in the same way other Muslims could. They could not refuse a posting. But they were also the best paid, best fed, best equipped soldiers in the empire. They received regular salaries from the imperial treasury. They were issued boots, weapons, and rations. When they marched at the front of the column. When they ate first. When they were wounded, they were treated by surgeons. The empire had invested 20 years and an enormous amount of money in each of them, and it had no intention of letting that investment die in a ditch. Yusuf the Azab came from somewhere else entirely. He was born around 1660 in central Anatolia, in a village whose name has not survived. His father was a peasant farmer who grew wheat and lentils on a small plot of land owned by a Sipahi cavalryman who had been granted the village as a fief. The harvests were never enough. The taxes were always too high. When Yusuf was 12, a drought killed the wheat. When he was 14, a second drought killed everything else. By the time he was 17, his father was dead, his mother was dead, and 2 of his sisters had been sold to a slave merchant from Damascus. Yusuf walked west. He walked for weeks. He arrived eventually in a town near the Imperial Highway and slept in a doorway behind a baker's shop. He was 18 years old, starving, and had no skills except for the ability to swing a hoe. Then an army came through. Ottoman campaigns recruited irregulars at every stop. Officers called Azab Agas set up tables in the town squares and offered bread, a small advance of coin, and the promise of a share in any loot taken from the enemy. There was no training. There was no oath. There was barely even a uniform. You signed your name or made your mark in a ledger. You were given a cheap sword or a spear, and you were told to fall in at the back of the column. The Azabs were peasant infantry. They were used to dig trenches, to throw themselves at city walls during siege assaults, to absorb the first volleys of enemy fire so that the Janissaries could advance behind them. Yusuf signed the ledger. He was given a spear. He was told he would be paid a small wage and could keep whatever he could carry out of the next city the army took. He did not know how to fight. He did not know how to march. He did not know that the empire considered him expendable from the moment he made his mark in that ledger. He only knew that he was hungry and that the army had bread. That is the bargain that brought him to the road to Vienna. Maimed had been built by the empire over 20 years. Yusuf had been bought by the empire for the price of a loaf and a promise. And when they walked the same 1,000 miles together in the summer of 1683, the empire treated them accordingly. The march to Vienna began in March of 1683. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, had assembled an army of roughly 150,000 men outside Edirne and given the order to advance. The campaign's official goal was to capture the Habsburg capital and complete the conquest that had been attempted and failed 150 years earlier under Suleiman the Magnificent. The army moved north along the Salkal at the pace of a slow walk, roughly 12 to 15 miles per day. It would take them 5 months to reach Vienna. Maimed's unit was in the vanguard. Janissary regiments always marched in the lead, partly for prestige and partly because they were the most reliable troops. When the column arrived at a Menzil station, the Janissaries were fed first. The grain was measured out by officers called sorbasis, the soup masters, who supervised the distribution of rations within each regiment. A janissary received roughly 2 pounds of grain per day, supplemented by mutton when it was available and by hardtack biscuit when it was not. He drank from cisterns the empire had built and maintained for centuries. He slept in tents that had been transported ahead of the army by a separate logistics corps. Yusuf's unit was at the rear. The Azabs marched behind the cavalry, behind the artillery, behind the packed trains. By the time they reached a Menzil station, most of the food had already been distributed. The sorbasis of the irregular units received what was left. Sometimes that was enough. Often it was not. When the food ran short, the Azabs were told to forage. Foraging meant raiding the villages along the road that had already been raided by the units in front of them. By the time the Azabs arrived, the villages were empty. The grain pits had been opened. The livestock had been driven away. The peasants had fled into the hills. Yusuf went hungry for the first time within a week of leaving Edirne. The two units crossed paths for the first time in Belgrade in May. The city was the main staging point for campaigns into Hungary, and the entire army gathered there for a week to be reviewed by the Grand Vizier. Mehmed was issued new boots. Yusuf was not. Mehmed's regiment received a special bread ration in honor of the review. Yusuf's regiment received its standard ration, which had already been cut twice since leaving Istanbul. They crossed paths again in Buda in late June. By then the disease had started. Dysentery moved through the irregular units first because they were drinking from rivers and unimproved wells, while the janissaries drank from the imperial cisterns. By the time the army reached the outskirts of Vienna on the 14th of July, the Azabs had lost roughly 15% of their strength to sickness and desertion. The janissaries had lost less than 3%. The siege began. For 2 months, the Ottoman army battered the walls of Vienna with artillery and mine warfare. The janissaries dug the trenches, but they were protected. They worked in shifts. They were fed regularly. They were rotated to the rear when they grew tired. The Azabs were used as labor and as assault troops. When a section of wall was finally breached on the morning of September 4th, it was Azab regiments that were ordered to lead the assault. They climbed the rubble under musket fire from the Viennese defenders. Most of them died on the slope. The breach was held by the defenders. The assault failed. Yusuf was in that assault. He survived because the man in front of him caught a musket ball that would otherwise have hit him. He spent the rest of the day pulling other men out of the rubble, listening to them scream, watching them die. By the time he made it back to his unit's camp, he had not eaten in 2 days. On the 12th of September, the Polish King Jan Sobieski arrived with a relief army of roughly 70,000 men. He attacked the Ottoman siege lines from the Kahlenberg Heights north of the city. By the end of the day, the Ottoman army had broken. The retreat began that night. It is the retreat that tells you everything about the Ottoman system, not the march out, not the siege, the retreat. The order of withdrawal was established by imperial protocol that had been refined over centuries. The Sultan's tent and the Grand Vizier's headquarters were evacuated first, escorted by janissary regiments. The imperial treasury, which traveled with the army, was loaded onto wagons and sent south under heavy guard. The artillery was supposed to be evacuated next, but most of it had to be abandoned in the field because there was no time and no draft animals left to pull it. After the artillery came the janissary infantry regiments. Mehmed's unit was given priority loading on the supply wagons that were still functional. He climbed aboard a wagon outside the village of Petronil, sometime in the early morning hours of the 13th of September. His feet were bleeding. He had not slept in 3 days, but he was on a wagon. The wagon was moving south. He would survive. The Azabs were told to walk. There were no wagons for the irregular infantry. There were no rations distributed for the retreat. The officers told the Azab regiments to make their way south independently and to rejoin the main army at Buda. There was no plan beyond that. The men were given no food, no water, no maps, no protection. They were simply released into the Hungarian countryside and told to find their own way home. The countryside was hostile. The peasants whose villages had been emptied by the Suisat on the way north now saw their chance. Stragglers were ambushed. Wounded men were stripped and killed for their clothes. The dysentery that had weakened the irregular regiments at the siege exploded into full epidemic on the retreat. Men collapsed by the roadside and were left where they fell. The army that had marched north with such discipline disintegrated into thousands of small groups of starving men trying to walk home. Yusuf walked for 9 days. He walked through villages that refused to open their doors. He drank from streams that gave him fever within hours. He watched men he had served with for 6 months sit down by the road and refuse to get up. He kept walking because he did not know what else to do. On the 9th day, somewhere outside the town of Mohawks, in a field beside a small stream, Yusuf sat down to rest and did not stand up again. He was 23 years old. He had walked roughly 200 miles on the retreat. He had eaten 3 times in those 9 days. His body was found by a Hungarian farmer 2 weeks later and buried in a shallow grave at the edge of the field. There was no marker. There was no record. The only reason his name survives at all is that a Janissary officer named Ibrahim wrote a letter back to Istanbul mentioning him by name in a list of Azabs who had been recruited from a particular town and were now presumed lost. The letter survives in an archive in Istanbul. The grave does not. Maimed reached Istanbul in early December. He had ridden in wagons most of the way. He had been fed at every menzil station. When he was sick, a surgeon had treated him. When his boots failed, he had been issued new ones from imperial stockpiles. He was thin and exhausted and had buried friends along the way, but he was alive. He returned to his barracks. He drew his salary. 3 years later, he was promoted. He died of old age in Istanbul in 1721, 38 years after the retreat from Vienna. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen on the road. A line attributed to him in a later chronicle, recorded by a fellow Janissary who claimed to have known him, has him saying near the end of his life, "We were fed because the Sultan needed us to kill, not because he loved us." There is no such record of Yusuf's last words, but a Hungarian priest who tended to dying Ottoman stragglers near Mohawks in the autumn of 1683 wrote in his parish journal that one of the men he attended, a young Anatolian who spoke broken Turkish and was clearly an irregular, told him before he died, "I came for bread. I am dying for someone else's road." The 2 men had walked the same road. They had fought in the same war. They had served the same sultan. And the empire had decided, before either of them was old enough to understand what was happening, that one of them would come home and the other would not. This is the part of the story where you might expect the Ottomans to look unique in their cruelty. They were not. Every empire that ever moved a large army across a continent built a system like this. The Romans did it first, and they did it most explicitly. The legions of the Roman army were full citizens. They received regular pay, medical care, retirement benefits, and a grant of land at the end of their service. The auxiliary regiments, recruited from conquered provinces, received less of everything and were used for the dangerous work. When a Roman army crossed a hostile frontier, it was the auxiliaries who scouted ahead, the auxiliaries who held the dangerous sections of the line, the auxiliaries who died in disproportionate numbers. The legions came home. The auxiliaries often did not. Napoleon's army did the same thing in reverse during the catastrophic retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1812. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite, was kept in reserve almost the entire campaign. When the retreat began, the Guard received priority on whatever food and shelter remained. The line regiments, the conscripts from France and the Allied units from Germany, Italy, and Poland, were left to starve and freeze in their tens of thousands. Of the 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia in June, fewer than 100,000 made it back across the Niemen River in December. Almost all of the survivors were Guard or senior officers. The conscripts died in the snow because the system had decided in advance that they were the ones who would die. The Ottomans were not unusual, they were typical. What makes their case so visible to us now is the documentation. The Ottoman bureaucracy was meticulous. Every menzil station kept records of how much grain it distributed and to which regiments. Every campaign generated thousands of pages of logistical correspondence. We can see the sorting happen in the paperwork. We can read the orders that loaded the janissaries onto wagons and told the Azabs to walk. The cruelty is not hidden. It is itemized. And once you see it, you start to see what the empire was actually built on. Not faith, not the courage of the men in the white caps, not even the genius of the sultans. The empire was built on the systematic decision to spend the lives of one class of soldier to preserve the lives of another. The 1,000-mile campaign was possible because the empire had pre-sorted its army into men it would feed and men it would not. The janissaries marched 1,000 miles and came home because the system carried them. The Azabs marched 1,000 miles and died because the system spent them. There is a temptation, when telling stories like this, to focus on the soldiers themselves, to talk about their toughness, to marvel at the distances they covered and the conditions they endured, and those things are real. The men who marched the Sol Call were extraordinary in ways that modern soldiers cannot easily understand, but the toughness is not the point. The toughness was extracted from them by a machine that had decided who deserved to come home. Maim's quote, if he ever really said it, gets at this exactly. We were fed because the Sultan needed us to kill, not because he loved us. The janissaries understood their position. They knew they were valuable, and they knew the valuation was conditional. They were kept alive because the empire needed killers it could trust. The moment that need ended, the support would end with it. Within 150 years of the retreat from Vienna, the Janissary Corps itself would be destroyed by the empire it had served. The machine that had carried maimed home would eventually turn on his successors and slaughter them in their barracks. The system always knew what it was doing. Yusuf's line, recorded by the Hungarian priest, gets at something else. I came for bread. I am dying for someone else's road. The Azabs were never part of the empire in the way the Janissaries were. They were rented. They were bought for the price of a loaf and discarded when the loaf ran out. The road to Vienna was not their road. The conquest was not their conquest. The glory, when there was any, belonged to other men. They were the fuel. They were never the fire. The road from Istanbul to Vienna still exists. If you drive it today, you follow modern highways that trace the same path the Ottoman army walked. The E80, the E75, the names have changed. The borders have multiplied. The empires that fought along this road are all gone, replaced by smaller nations with different flags and different languages. But the infrastructure is the same. The route through the Balkans that the Ottoman engineers maintained for 400 years is still the easiest way to move overland from Istanbul to Central Europe. The roads outlived the soldiers. They outlived the sultans. They outlived the empire itself. The pattern that the system built into that road also outlived the empire. We don't have Devshirme anymore. We don't have Azab regiments. But the basic logic of sorting some people into the category of worth saving and others into the category of acceptable losses has not gone anywhere. It has evolved. It has put on new uniforms and learned new languages and found new ways to justify itself. But the calculation is the same one that the Ottoman sorbasis were making 4 centuries ago at the menzil stations. Some lives are investments, other lives are fuel, and the difference between the two is almost never about courage or skill or even loyalty. It is about which category the system decided you belonged to before you ever picked up a weapon. When we talk about the Ottoman conquests, we talk about the speed and the scale and the discipline. We talk about the Janissaries and the sultans and the great commanders. We talk about Suleiman and Maimed the Conqueror and the gates of Vienna. We do not usually talk about the men who walked at the back of the column, the men who ate last, the men who were told to walk home when the wagons rolled south without them. the men who died in fields outside Mohawks in Buda and Belgrade, and were buried by foreign priests who could not pronounce their names. That is the part of the story they do not usually tell you, not the marching, not the conquest, the sorting. If this hit you the way it hit me, you'll want to see what happened to the Janissaries themselves, the men who survived the road, the men the empire built and fed and trusted for 4 centuries, because in 1826, the same empire that had carried them home from Vienna would turn its cannons on them in their own barracks in Istanbul and burn the core to the ground. The men who endured the 1,000-mile road were eventually destroyed by the road's owner. That video is on screen now. Subscribe if you want more. I cover the parts of history that got buried on purpose.